whispered reading of James and the Giant Peach. Last time I read from chapters 1 to 9. How are you, by the way? I hope you are all doing very, very well. I have the fire and candlelight. Chapter 10. Into the Peach. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was the curious, bitter-sweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees. The walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight towards the very centre of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvellously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. Good heavens, he said, I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach. Then he noticed there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here," and another one said, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and stared at the speakers, his face agog with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown insects. An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So, would you call it? What would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog. You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper there was an enormous spider, and next to the spider there was a giant ladybird with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair on a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in curled up positions. There were a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor, over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly, and nobody was paying any attention to it. Every time one of these creatures was at least as Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced, suddenly staring hard at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper said. "So am I," the ladybird cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everyone's famished," he said. "We need food." 4 pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider opened her mouth and ran along. The spider opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the old green grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing," the ladybird cried. "I do believe he thinks it's him that we are wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all sides. "Oh dear," they said. "What an awful thought." "You mustn't be frightened," the ladybird said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know cheer up," the centipede said, "and meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all off by myself." Chapter 12. Centipede's Boots. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable, so he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. "Thank you so much," the centipede said. "You are very kind. You have lots of boots," James murmured. "I have a lot of legs," the centipede answered proudly, "and a lot of feet, 100 to be exact." "There he goes again," the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. "He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyway, there is nothing marvellous, centipede, about having a lot of legs." "Poor fellow," the centipede said, whispering in James's ear. "He's blind. He can't see how splendid I look. In my opinion," the earthworm said, "the really marvellous thing is to have no legs at all, and to be able to walk just the same." "You call that walking?" cried the centipede. "You're a slitherer. That's all you are. You just slither along." "I glide," said the earthworm primly. "You are a slimy beast," answered the centipede. I am not a slimy beast," the earthworm said. "I am a useful and much loved creature. Ask any gardener you like, and as for you—" "I am a pest," the centipede announced, grinning broadly and looking round the room for approval. "He's so proud of that," the ladybird said, smiling at James, "though for the life of me I cannot understand why. I am the only pest in this room," cried the centipede, still grinning away, "unless you count old green grasshopper over there. But he's long past it now. He is too old to be a pest any more." The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice, "I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybird. "James," the centipede said, "your name is James, isn't it?" "Yes. Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvellous colossal centipede as me?" "I certainly haven't," James answered. "How on earth did you get to be like that?" "Very peculiar," the centipede said. ladybird said. I swallowed 3, the centipede cried. But who's telling this story anyway? Don't interrupt. It's too late to tell stories now, the old green grasshopper announced. It's time to go to sleep. I refuse to sleep in my boots, the centipede cried. How many more are there to come off, James? I think I've done about 20 so far, James told him. Then that leaves 80 to go, the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. He's lying again. The centipede roared with laughter. Stop pulling the earthworm's leg, the ladybird said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. Pulling his leg, he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. Which leg am I pulling? You tell me. James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal. But what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing aloud in all the time he had been with them. We really must get some sleep, the old grasshopper said. We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow. So would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds? Chapter 13, Off to Bed. A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so that actually it looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. I do hope you'll find it comfortable, Miss Spider, said to the old green grasshopper. I made it as soft and silky as I possibly could. I spun it with gossamer. That's much better quality thread than the one I use for my own bed. Thank you so much, my dear lady, the old grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. Ah, this is just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Good night. Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and the ladybird got in. After that, she spun a long one for the centipede, and an even longer one for the earthworm. And how do you like your bed? She said to James when it came to his turn. Hard or soft? I like it soft, thank you very much, James answered. For goodness sake, stop staring round the room and get on with my boots, the centipede said. You and I are never going to get any sleep at this rate, and kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder. James worked away frantically on the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off. And to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most terrible, complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours, and by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all and had lined them up in a row on the floor, 21 pairs altogether, the centipede was fast asleep. Wake up, centipede, whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. It's time for bed. Thank his hammock. James got into his own hammock, and oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared with the hard bare boards that his aunts had always made him sleep upon at home. "Lights out," said the centipede drowsily. Nothing happened. "Turn out the light," he called, raising his voice. James glanced round the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybird was making whistling noises as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at one end of his hammock, wheezing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the centre of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. "I said turn out the light," shouted the centipede angrily. "Are you talking to me?" James asked him. "Of course I'm not talking to you," the centipede answered. "That silly glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on." For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he saw a most extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a gigantic fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long, was standing upside down upon its 6 legs in the middle of the ceiling, and the tail end of this creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. "Is that a glowworm?" asked James, staring at the light. "It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to me." "Of course it's a glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that's what she calls herself. Although, actually, you are quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They are simply fireflies without wings. Wake up, you lazy beast." But the glowworm didn't stir. So the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked up one of his boots from the floor. "Put out that wretched light," he shouted, hurling the boot up at the ceiling. The glowworm slowly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. There is no need to be rude," she said coldly, all in good time. Come on, come on," shouted the centipede, "or I'll put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," the glowworm said, looking down and giving James a little wave. And a smile. "I didn't see you come in. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome, and good night." Then click, and out went the light. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness, with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. At all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful, in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went on between them. "Good night, old green grasshopper," he whispered. "Good night, ladybird. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he could off, someone was shouting. We're off at last. James woke up with a jump and looked about him. The creatures were all out of their hammocks and moving excitedly around the room. Suddenly, the floor gave a great heave, as though an earthquake were taking place. Here we go, shouted the old green grasshopper, hopping up and down with excitement. Hold on tight. What's happening? Cried James, leaping on his hammock. What's going on? The ladybird, who was obviously a kind and gentle creature, came over and stood beside him. In case you don't know it, she said, we are about to depart forever from the top of this ghastly hill that we've all been living on for so long. We are about to roll away inside this great, big, beautiful beach to a land of what? Asked James. Never you mind, said the ladybird, but nothing could be worse than this desolate hilltop, and those two repulsive aunts of yours. Here, here, they all shouted. Here, here. You may not have noticed it, the ladybird went on, but the whole garden, even before it reaches the steep edge of the hill, happens to be on a steep slope, and therefore the only thing that has been stopping this beach from rolling away right from the beginning is the thick stem attaching it to the tree. Break the stem and off we go. Watch it, cried Miss Spider as the room gave another violent lurch. Here we go. Not quite, not quite. At this moment, continued the ladybird, our centipede, who has a pair of jaws as sharp as razors, is up there on top of the beach, nibbling away at that stem. In fact, he must nearly be through it, as you can tell from the way we're lurching about. Would you like me to take you under my wing, so that you won't fall over when we start rolling? That's very kind of you, said James, but I think I will be all right. I think I'll be all right. Just then the centipede stuck his grinning face through a hole in the ceiling and shouted, I've done it, we're off. We're off, the others cried. We're off, the journey begins, shouted the centipede, and who knows where it will end, muttered the earthworm. If you have anything to do with it, it can only mean trouble. Nonsense, said the ladybird. We are now about to visit the most marvellous places and see the most wonderful things. Isn't that so, centipede? There is no knowing what we shall see, cried the centipede. We may see a creature with 49 heads who lives in the desolate snow, and whenever it catches a cold, which it dreads, it has 49 noses to blow. We may see the enormous pink spotted scrunch, who can chew up someone with one bite. It likes to eat 5 of them roasted for lunch and 18 for its supper at night. We may see a dragon, and nobody knows that we won't see a unicorn. We may see a terrible monster with toes growing out of the tufts of its hair. We may see the sweet little bitty bright hen, so playful, so kind and well bred, and such beautiful eggs. You just boil them and then they explode and they blow off your head. A canoe and a rhinoceros, surely you'll see, and that venomous and honourable gnat, whose sting, when it stings you, goes in at the knee and comes out through the top of your hat. We may even get lost and be frozen by frost. We may die in an earthquake or tremor, or nastier still, we may even be tossed on the horns of a furious dilemma. But who cares? Let us go from this horrible hill. Let us roll. Let us bowl. Let us plunge. Let's go rolling and bowling and spinning until we're away from old Spiker and Sponge. 1 second later, slowly, insidiously, almost gently, the great peach started to lean forward and steal into motion. The whole room began to tilt over, and all the furniture went sliding across the floor and crashed against the far wall. So did James and the ladybird and the old green grasshopper and Miss Spider and the earthworm, and also the centipede, who had just come slithering quickly down the wall. Chapter 15. Goodbye, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. Outside in the garden, at that very moment, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker had just taken their places at the front gate, each with a bunch of tickets in her hand, and the first stream of early morning sightseers was visible in the distance climbing up the hill to view the peach. We shall make a fortune today, Aunt Spiker was saying. Just look at all those people. I wonder what became of that horrid little boy of ours last night, Aunt Sponge said. He never did come back in, did he? He probably fell down in the dark and broke his leg, Aunt Spiker said. Or his neck, maybe, Aunt Sponge said, hopefully. Just wait till I get my hands on him, Aunt Spiker said. He'll never want to stay out all night again by the time I've finished with him. Good gracious me, what's that awful noise? Both women swung round to look. The noise, of course, had been caused by the giant peach crashing through the fence that surrounded it, and now gathering speed. Every second it came rolling across the garden towards the place where Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were standing. They gaped. They started to run. They panicked. They both got in each other's way. They began pushing and jostling. Each one of them was thinking only about saving herself. Aunt Sponge tripped over a box that she'd brought along to keep the money in and fell flat on her face. Aunt Spiker immediately tripped over. Aunt Sponge and came down on top of her. They both lay on the ground fighting and clawing and yelling and struggling frantically to get up again. But before they could do this, the mighty peach was upon them. There was a crunch, and then there was a silence. The peach rolled on, and behind it, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker laid ironed out upon the grass as flat and thin and lifeless as a couple of paper dolls suddenly caught sight of this terrible monster plunging down upon them, and they screamed and scattered to right and left as it went hurtling by. At the bottom of the hill it charged across the road, knocking over a telegraph pole and flattening 2 parked cars as it went by. Then it rushed across about 20 fields, breaking down all the fences and hedges in its path. It went right through the middle of a herd of fine Jersey cows, and then through a flock of sheep, then through a paddock full of horses, and then through a yard full of pigs, and soon the whole countryside was a seething mass of panic-stricken animals, stampeding in all directions. The beach was still going at a tremendous speed, with no sign of slowing down, and about a mile further on it came to a village. Down the main street of the village it rolled, with people leaping frantically out of its path right and left, and at the end of the street it went crashing right through the wall of an enormous building and out the other side, leaving 2 gaping round holes in the brickwork. This building happened to be a famous factory where they made chocolate, and almost at once a great river of warm melted chocolate came pouring out of the holes in the factory wall. A minute later, this brown sticky mess was flowing through every street in the village, oozing under the doors of houses and into people's shops and gardens. Children were wading in it up to their knees, and some were even trying to swim in it, and all of them were sucking it into their mouths in great greedy gulps and shrieking with joy. But the beach rushed on across the countryside, on and on and on, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Cowsheds, stables, pigsties, barns, bungalows, hayricks, anything that got in its way went toppling over like a 9-pin. An old man sitting quietly beside a stream had his fishing rod whisked out of his hands as it went dashing by, and a woman called Daisy Entwistle was standing so close to it as it passed that she had the skin taken off the top of the tip of her long nose. Would it ever stop? Why should it? A round object will always keep rolling as long as it is on a downward slope, and in this case the land sloped downhill all the way until it reached the ocean, the same ocean that James had begged his aunts to be allowed to visit the day before. Well, perhaps he was going to visit it now. The beach was rushing closer and closer to it every second, and closer also to the towering white cliffs that came first. These cliffs are the most famous in the whole of England, and they are hundreds of feet high. Below them the sea is deep and cold and hungry. Many ships have been swallowed up and lost forever on this part of the coast, and all the sailors who were in them as well. The beach was only 100 yards away from the cliff now. Now 50, now 20, now 10, now 5, and when it reached the edge of the cliff, it seemed to leap up into the sky and hang there suspended for a few seconds, still turning over and plunging and bounding wildly downward. Then the whole thing became a nightmare. James found himself being flung up against the ceiling, then back onto the floor, then sideways against the wall, then up onto the ceiling again, and up and down and back and forth and round, and at the same time all the other creatures were flying through the air in every direction, and so were the chairs and the sofa, not to mention the 42 boots belonging to the centipede. Everything and all of them were being rattled around like peas inside an enormous rattle that was being rattled by a giant who refused to stop. To make it worse, something went wrong with the glowworm's lighting system, and the room was in pitchy darkness. There were screams and yells and curses and cries of pain, and everything kept going round and round, and once James made a frantic grab at some thick bars sticking out from the wall, only to find they were a couple of centipede's legs. "Let go, you clown," shouted the centipede, kicking himself free, and James was promptly flung across the room into the old green grasshopper's lap. Twice he got tangled up in Miss Spider's legs, a horrid business, and towards the end the poor earthworm, who was cracking himself like a whip every time he flew through the air from one side of the room to the other, coiled himself around James's body in a panic and refused to unwind. Oh, it was a frantic and terrible trip, but it was all over now, and the room was suddenly very still and quiet. Everybody was beginning slowly and painfully to disentangle themselves from everybody else. "Let's have some light," shouted the centipede. "Yes," they cried, "light, give us some light." "I'm trying," answered the poor glowworm. "I'm doing my best, please be patient." They all waited in silence. Then a faint greenish light began to glimmer out of the glowworm's tail, and this became stronger and stronger, until it was anyway enough to see by. Some great journey," the centipede said, limping across the room. "I shall never be the same again," murmured Earthworm. "Nor I," the ladybird said. "It's taken years of my life, but my dear friends," cried the old green grasshopper, trying to be cheerful, "we are there." "Where?" they asked. "Where? Where is where?" "I don't know," the old green grasshopper said, "but I'll bet it's somewhere good." "We are probably at the bottom of a coal mine," the earthworm said gloomily. "We certainly went down and down and down very suddenly at the last moment. I felt it in my stomach. I feel it. I still feel it. Perhaps we are in the middle of a beautiful country full of songs and music," the old green grasshopper said. "Or near the seashore," said James eagerly, "with lots of other children down on the sand for me to play with." "Pardon me," murmured the ladybird, looking a little ill, "but am I wrong in thinking that we seem to be bobbing up and down, bobbing up and down?" they cried. "What on earth do you mean?" "You're still giddy from the journey," the old green grasshopper told her. "You'll get over it in a minute. Is everybody ready to go upstairs now and take a look round?" "Yes, yes," they chorused. "Come on, let's go. I refuse to show myself out of doors in my bare feet," the centipede said. "I have to get my boots on again first." "For heaven's sake, let's not go through all that nonsense again," the earthworm said, "Let's all help the centipede and get it over with," Ladybird said. "Come on." So they did, all except Miss Spider, who set about weaving a long rope ladder that would reach from the floor to a hole in the ceiling. The old grasshopper had wisely said that they must not risk going out of the side entrance when they didn't know where they were, but must first of all go up onto the top of the beach and have a look round. So half an hour later, when the rope ladder had been finished and hung, and the 42nd boot had been laced neatly onto the centipede's 42nd foot, they were all ready to go out, amid mounting excitement and shouts of "Here we go, folks, the promised land. I can't wait to see it." The whole company climbed up the ladder, one by one, and disappeared into a dark, soggy tunnel in the ceiling that went steeply, almost vertically upward. Thank you for joining me today, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. Please stay tuned for my next video. I hope to read the rest of James and the Giant Peach over the coming weeks. It is almost Christmas here, and it's the 19th of December, and I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all a fantastic Christmas and a wonderful New Year. I hope all of your dreams will come to fruition in